There is a pervasive ideology in Western countries that is core to enabling their support of Israel. You've likely felt it, though perhaps without actually consciously perceiving it. This ideology is the bedrock through which anything resembling actually effective action against the crucial Western backing for the state of Israel is nipped in the bud, long before it can even really get close to getting anywhere. It enforces a narrow spectrum of acceptable anti-Israel discourse, excluding from the majority of the public sphere anything that runs counter to Israel's underlying Jewish supremacist ideological framework, known as Zionism. And it's so successful in this role that it even often leads genuinely well-meaning people who want to be pro-Palestinian into upholding what are ultimately Zionist positions. It also even leads them into attacking others who do hold anti-Zionist positions with smears of anti-Semitism, creating a cycle where large parts of the pro-Palestinian movement spend time and effort on obediently policing themselves into complete impotency. This ideology is not often noticed, let alone actually talked about, so it doesn't have a commonly used name. So allow me to coin one. Jewish Exceptionalism. This term can be understood literally. It's the idea that Israel and its underpinning Zionist ideology are uniquely justified because they are conceived of as being Jewish. Jews are considered by this Jewish exceptionalist framework to be a special group of people, one that is practically innately oppressed, and this supposed innate oppression is used to spread the notion that Israel, as the self-described Jewish state, needs to be given a special exception from standards otherwise widely accepted as normal. This has become something of a taken-for-granted, common-sense notion in many Western countries, basically like the sun rising in the morning. And once you really start perceiving it and thinking about it, you see it everywhere. This video is going to be dissecting this idea of Jewish exceptionalism, explaining how it manifests, how it functions, and why, going over a number of different examples to do so. The rest of this video is going to be presented as something of a slideshow, like a PowerPoint presentation. So if you would prefer, you could listen to it as you would a podcast, though I am still going to include some important things on the screen, like citing my sources, written explanations of the concepts that I'm talking about at the time, and perhaps indicative images or visual aids. So keep that in mind as you continue watching. All cited sources will be included in the description and/or in the pinned comment, numbered in order of first appearance. So with that out of the way, let's continue. So let's begin here with some general examples of what we're talking about to help you get a grasp on it. Usually, a country founded in living memory on the mass expulsion and killing of most of the prior population would be considered quite illegitimate, and the victims of this barbarity widely supported in their pursuit of justice and restitution. Yet in the West, Israel's founding is instead often framed as an act of self-determination, of liberation, and even of justice. Reality is reversed, with the victims of this framed as evil and anti-Semitic themselves for daring to continue to lay claim to what's been taken from them, simply because their victimizers happen to be Jewish. The idea that any other country should specifically be run for the benefit of one single racial or ethnic group, what is known as an ethno-state, would normally cause revulsion among many. But for Israel, this is framed entirely differently, as both justified and a necessity, something that is usually just totally unquestioned. And you'd expect that decades of brutal occupation of millions of people, which is so clear as day and obvious that even Israel's own allies have been forced to admit that it's an occupier, at least in part, would usually be talked about bluntly, matter-of-factly, succinctly, without mincing words. And it would be normal to frame those who fight against this as being in the right. And yet those who fight back against Israel are actually instead denounced in the West, regardless of the actual circumstances. And even mild acknowledgement of what Israel does to its victims is commonly prefaced with a flurry of ritualistically repeated phrases, like denouncing anti-Semitism, affirming that the Israeli occupier state has a right to exist and a right to defend itself, and outright denouncing those who resist it. There's also more subtle ways in which this Jewish exceptionalism manifests. For example, the way the pro-Palestinian movement itself often feels obliged to seek approval from Jewish people, and tends to put its Jewish members on a pedestal, going to pains to cater to them. This is a practice that would make absolutely no sense outside of the framework of Jewish exceptionalism, since it's otherwise completely nonsensical to seek approval and validation to denounce an ethnostate from people who happen to be from the dominant ethnic group of said ethnostate. Similarly, arguments are often had about what percentage of Jewish people worldwide are Zionists and support Israel, as if to say that whether Zionism and Israel are acceptable or not depends on what people who are of the group that Zionism exists to benefit think of it. It's only due to Jewish exceptionalism that arguments like this can seem reasonable rather than insane, as the reality is that even if every single Jewish person was a Zionist, it would still be a fundamentally abhorrent ideology. Once you remove that element, the argument makes about as much sense as going back to Germany in 1940 and saying that Nazism was legitimate because a majority of Germans supported it. You'd think that it would make more sense to poll the victims rather than the potential beneficiaries. Those are just some of the examples of how this manifests. The fundamental bedrock of all of those examples is the assumption that Israel must be conceived of differently and be considered a special exception to normal standards because it's majority Jewish. And throughout this video, we're going to be going over and dissecting many more examples that are much more specific than those. But suffice to say, this heavily limits how we talk about Israel, and ultimately serves to lead people away from understanding the meat and bones of why Israel is how it is, and the root causes of the things that it does, which in turn prevents us from even thinking about fighting against it as effectively as possible. And that's precisely why Jewish exceptionalism is enforced. Jewish exceptionalism is spread and used by the Western media, Western governments, NGOs, lobbying groups, activists, and other such allies to enforce so-called liberal or left Zionism as the allowed mainstream limit of respectable left-leaning opinion on the Israel-Palestine issue. These liberal Zionist positions are then presented by them as actually being pro-Palestinian, and any notion that this may not actually be the case is kept as far out of frame as possible. This, in turn, ensures that the ideology of Jewish supremacy that is inherent to Zionism can continue in the land of Palestine, because liberal or left Zionism is still Zionism, so it's still completely on board with the Jewish supremacist fundamentals of the Israeli ethno-nationalist project, which are the entire root of the problem. I need a quick aside here to explain what liberal Zionism and left Zionism are before moving on, and I'll be going into further depth on this later as well. These are ideologies that seek to blend supposedly liberal or left-wing principles with Zionism, but that means that they still fundamentally believe in the innately repressive and unjust founding tenets of Zionism and the State of Israel, namely, that it should and must be a state that exists to benefit those it considers Jewish over others, and that it thus must give special privileges to those considered to be a part of that group, and that it must take active measures to ensure that it maintains a sizable Jewish ethnic majority as a matter of official policy, regardless of who else is harmed by this. This is an innately genocidal ideology, given that it requires that the previous society be practically erased in order for it to be implemented. But liberal and left Zionists feel kind of bad about the fact that their ethnic supremacist ambitions necessarily come at the expense of Palestinians, who had to be expelled and murdered en masse to enable this project to exist. And since these victims have refused to go quietly, refusing to renounce their claim to their homeland, and continuing to fight back against Israel, Israel has also needed to keep oppressing them so that its ethno-nationalist project can continue. So liberal and left Zionists attempt to assuage the guilt they feel for this by advocating for marginally better treatment of Palestinians, but only within the heavily limited confines that their overarching Zionist belief system allows them. It's also very common that their main point of opposition to this is actually that they think it's bad for Israel, not necessarily that they think it hurts Palestinians. So they may believe that the worst impulses of Israel, like its expansion into the West Bank or its attacks on Gaza, are unjust, but they are certainly not for addressing the actual root of the problem of Palestinian oppression, which causes such actions in the first place. The fact that a state fundamentally built on land theft and the subsequent exclusion of the prior population, run by and for one group of people at the expense of another, is never going to be anything but repulsive and unacceptable. So liberal Zionists Zionists, despite sometimes appearing as allies, still seek to maintain the systems that are at the crux of the problem of the Palestinian question, though this can be harder to notice than it is with open and honest Zionists, since they tend to mask it behind softer rhetoric. This makes liberal Zionists some of the most dangerous enemies of the struggle for justice for Palestinians, because more outright and open Zionists are a lot easier to notice and fight against, as they proudly announce Jewish supremacy as their ultimate goal. But liberal Zionists are something of a wolf in sheep's clothing, as they hide their pursuit of very similar aims behind a thin coat of humanitarian paint. So you need to already be somewhat intimately familiar with the Palestinian cause before you are knowledgeable enough to be able to see through the thin veneer of empathy and identify liberal and left Zionists as the enemies who they actually are, which results in many well-meaning, potentially pro-Palestinian people being duped by them. Stuff like saying occupation is bad and the IDF goes too far in Gaza are very entry-level positions, easy to understand and digest. Those acts are obviously unacceptable, they hurt people, they shouldn't happen. But understanding why those things happen, and thus being able to actually effectively advocate against them, requires a real anti-Zionist, anti-colonial framework that elucidates the source of the problem. And that's how liberal and left Zionists lead people astray, because many of them are okay with proclaiming their opposition to Israel's worst actions, which can on the surface make them seem like allies, but they very much support and work to maintain the root causes of said actions. And that's precisely why they are painted as actually being pro-Palestinian in the mainstream, to funnel potential pro-Palestinian energy into an ideology that, in reality, is very much pro-Israel, and thus anti-Palestinian. Exposing people to actual pro-Palestinian ideas with any regularity would risk getting them too close to diagnosing the actual problem, which eventually could potentially compromise Western support of Israel, and they can't have that. In short, the idea is to limit us to, at most, denouncing what Israel does and not what Israel is. They will begrudgingly allow us to denounce what it does in order to maintain a faux aura of reasoned debate existing in Western society on the issue, provided that we never quite get to the root of why it's always been doing it. So we can, say, blame Netanyahu and the Israeli far right for the Gaza genocide, but we can't go any further and link it to the source, the ethno-nationalism and colonialism that is inherent to Israel's overarching ideology of Zionism, which practically all Israelis adhere to, not just Netanyahu. And these limits on our speech are mainly achieved through the enforcement of Jewish exceptionalism. So, why does this ideology exist? Why is it enforced? Why is it needed for Israel specifically? And why has it been allowed to become so pervasive? It's because there is a symbiotic relationship between Western imperialism and Zionism. Israel's existence gives the West what is strategically a big, autonomous Western military base in a hugely geopolitically important region. That alone is huge for their power projection. Its mere presence is enough to drastically alter the regional balance of power, helping to keep other Middle Eastern countries in line. Without Israel, the Middle East could have ended up with a number of powerful countries, all pursuing their own interests far more independently of Western whims, and perhaps even banding together against the West. Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, all of those countries were historically regional powers, and they still likely would be today if not for Israel. Instead, Egypt is now a glorified Western puppet after decades of conflict with Israel. Syria is in complete disarray following a civil war that Israel was pervasively involved in. Iraq is still struggling for basic stability after multiple US invasions, and Saudi Arabia is just a straight-up Western ally. All that's left to potentially challenge Western hegemony is Iran, which, while still a regional power, is far weaker than it otherwise might have been, isolated from most potential allies due to Western and Israeli influence in the region. This situation is, in large part, a result of the disruptive role that Israel plays in Middle Eastern geopolitics, which suits the West very well. Israel is also very happy to do the very dirty things that the Western powers don't like to often do themselves anymore, at least not openly, like brazenly assassinating Iranian officials and scientists, for example, just in full view of the public. It also gives them a convenient, never-ending human testing ground for the latest in military, policing, and surveillance technology and strategies, which they then employ themselves. In exchange, the West provides Israel with the military support, the weapons, and the diplomatic and media cover that is necessary for the continuation of its 80-year-long reign of terror on the Palestinians and on the broader Middle East. And for them, this is a relatively small investment. A few $billions here and there is really next to nothing for the richest countries in the world, especially since most of the money that they give Israel is then spent on weapons from their own arms companies anyway. It's a win-win. Aside from the negative press that this has a whole lot of potential to bring them, of course, because Israel brazenly and openly goes far beyond what they're usually able to cover for and excuse among their allies. And this has only gotten worse and worse for them over time, as standards have shifted and the public have gradually learned more and more about the issue, as well as broader histories of colonialism, which is now reviled. That's particularly inconvenient because Israel's actions and its very core ideology are precisely the sort of things that were supposedly meant to have been left in the 19th century. Clear and open, European-style settler colonialism, quite analogous to the USA and its campaign against Native Americans, Australia and its campaign against Aboriginal people, or a myriad of other similar examples. The West Bank and Gaza are essentially just modern, more densely populated Native American reservations, where as many people as possible who are considered undesirable to Israel's ethno-nationalist project are kept confined there and under its ultimate control and authority, in the hope that it might eventually be able to implement a more permanent solution to the problem that their existence poses to its ambitions. But Israel does all of this today, in the 21st century, not the 19th. Not on horseback with muskets and rifles, but rather with all of the most modern technologies of murder, surveillance, and control. And as technology has advanced, so too has the ability for people to capture and share images of Israel's atrocities, bypassing what was only decades ago the incredibly effective filter of the Western media, creating the potential for even more of a public relations nightmare for Israel's Western allies. So there needs to be something more that can be used to justify this, especially with the developments of the last few decades, given how plainly out of line it all is with everything that the West pretends to stand for. And that's where Jewish exceptionalism comes in. If Jews, no matter who they are, no matter where they are, no matter what circumstances they're actually in, no matter what year it is, are believed to carry some sort of magical, essential, ethnic essence that makes them innately oppressed, then Israel, as the self-described Jewish state, can be reframed as actually being a victim, an exception, and thus uniquely acceptable. It should be made clear before proceeding that this core argument for Jewish exceptionalism is just bunk on the face of it, even if we don't contest the facts. Because even if it were true that Jews are a group who are always oppressed and always at immense risk of violence, that would still not justify ethno-nationalist settler colonialism being carried out against the people of a land that had little to nothing to do with said oppression, and especially not the oppression in Europe carried out by the Nazis, which is often used to justify Israel. And I don't think that anyone would genuinely argue as such in any other similar circumstance. For example, up to 75% of Europe's Romani population were wiped out by the Nazis, yet I've never seen an argument for a Romani colonial ethno-state. When justifications like this only ever seem to be made in one specific circumstance, rather than being a part of more broad, consistently applied principles, that's generally a good indication of the fact that they're not actually being made honestly. Also, on top of all that, the notion that Jews are sort of innately oppressed is also clearly not true. Oppression is a material, observable reality, just as it is for any other group of people, not something that you're just sort of born with, carried in the soul or whatever. An analysis of the present-day reality of Jewish people makes that very clear. 46% of the Jews in the world live in Israel, where, in reality, millions of others are oppressed for their benefits. That's kind of the opposite of being a victim. The other 54% almost universally live in Western countries, where most of them are solidly middle or upper middle class, and if anything, tend to earn above average incomes and hold above average social positions. A situation that is very much uncharacteristic of a group of people who are currently enduring systemic oppression. Compare them on both a material and social level to a group that very clearly is systematically oppressed, like black people in the USA, and the difference is very clear. Not solely in incomes, but also in other things, like incarceration rates, police profiling, and stuff like that. Jews have largely been accepted into whiteness, and today face little to no systemic disadvantage compared to other minorities in Western countries. Things have changed so much that, as I've discussed in a previous video, classic anti-Semitic tropes are actually being used more nowadays in an actual systemic sense against Arab migrants, often with the enthusiastic participation, no less, of pro-Israel Jews. This is not to say that actual anti-Semitism is a thing of the past, because it's clearly not. In particular, Jews are targeted quite frequently by far-right violence, but this mostly comes from the political fringes. Jews are most at risk of anti-Semitic hatred and violence from racist individuals and groups outside of formal politics, who hold little to no systemic power. In the case of other minorities like Black people, Latin American people in the USA, or Arabs, they face both that sort of racism combined with everyday systemic violence from the state itself. There are times where those who do have real systemic power and influence actually do legitimate anti-Semitism, but this is almost universally swept under the rug, because this anti-Semitism is today often blended with a fanatical support for Israel, and ultimately that is considered to be a much higher priority. So they get a free pass from powerful pro-Israel advocacy groups and the mainstream media to do at least a little bit of anti-Semitism here and there, as long as they also vocally back Israel, to the point that they can even just straight up Sieg Heil on live television, and groups supposedly dedicated to opposing anti-Semitism will cover for them. In summary, it's not the 1930s anymore, and the spectre of a second Holocaust is not around the corner. Power has shifted, and things have clearly changed. In fact, in actually presently existing non-hypothetical reality, the self-styled Jewish state of Israel is massacring people for their ethnicity right now with the fanatical support of the countries that carried out the Holocaust. If there is a real risk of another genocide somewhere, it's there, not against Jews in New York. We must also ask other questions like, is it actually safer for Jews to live in Israel than in the West? You know, this whole taken for granted idea that supposedly justifies the existence of Israel in the first place? Israel is a colonial state, which naturally breeds resistance from its victims, and that makes it less safe to live there. On top of that, Israel often uses its citizens as human shields for its colonial project, installing them in settlements directly on the colonial frontier, where the risk of resistance from the colonized population is far greater. And on top of that, they conscript most of their civilians into the military, which also has the potential to put them at further risk. Colonialism is a violent enterprise. It breeds violence in retaliation, which makes you less safe. If you move into someone else's house, into someone else's land, into someone else's country, the prior owners might just come and try to take it back. How exactly is that safer than, say, just being Jewish in New York? It's simply not even close. Of course, the risk for Israelis is nothing close to what it is for their Palestinian victims, and violence against them is not remotely the same thing as their violence against Palestinians, but it's still clearly more dangerous than it would be for them to just live in whatever Western city. Ultimately though, that shouldn't matter, because at risk or not, refugee or not, safer or not, it's still ethno-nationalist settler colonialism. Your supposed safety cannot come at the cost of an entire other people. There's also something to be said about the fact that having a country that proudly proclaims itself to be Jewish while brutalizing an entire group of people on an ethnic basis every single day, while carving Stars of David into their skin, graffitiing them into the walls of their stolen homes, and drawing them in the rubble of their communities, is obviously going to breed anti-Semitism all around the world. So if the point of Israel is to fight anti-Semitism, it seems to be doing a pretty bad job of it. So as you can see, there are many different angles from which you can attack the idea of Jewish exceptionalism. Pretty much nothing about it holds up to any sort of scrutiny. But the problem with that is that doesn't really matter, because you're not meant to even notice Jewish exceptionalism, let alone think about whether its implications make sense or not. So it's not meant to be a coherent argument that stands up to scrutiny. Rather, it exists as something in the background, largely unnoticed but constantly manifesting, which prevents people from asking more serious questions about Israel, Zionism, and even the broader history of Western colonialism and imperialism, and how Zionism links to them. And prevented we are indeed, because adherence to this framework is enforced via the ever-present threat of serious socioeconomic consequences for not doing so. Firstly, Jewish exceptionalism is rigorously adhered to and spread in every Western country by practically every mainstream politician, media personality, and significant public figure, even often by those who on the surface might appear to be pro-Palestine to an untrained observer. Its limits are policed by those groups of people and by Western governments and institutions in general, all working in tandem. They are also helped in this task by the Zionist lobby, comprised of pro-Israel advocacy groups backed by the governments of their countries. These groups often disingenuously present themselves as primarily being dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism, yet in reality, they are mainly interested in furthering broader Israeli and Western political interests, and a large part of this is policing the limits of acceptable anti-Israel speech that violates the Jewish exceptionalist framework. To give just one big example, the Anti-Defamation League is probably the most prominent of these groups, but there are many more that fulfill the same role in many different countries. The ever-present threat of being publicly accused of anti-Semitism by this systemically backed apparatus of enforcement ensures that there are potentially serious consequences for those who step outside of the bounds of the Jewish exceptionalist framework to actually talk about things like Zionism and colonialism. There's always the potential to be branded as an anti-Semite and be excluded from so-called polite society, get fired from your job, and have your life ruined. And this can happen to almost everyone, from a prominent political commentator to just a random student who posted something a bit too pro-Palestine on social media. This not only helps greatly to keep in line people who might otherwise be happy to call Israel out for what it is, but it also actively pushes them into accepting and spreading the Jewish exceptionalist narrative themselves. It's also just sort of presented as common sense, a taken for granted fact, as normal as our need to drink water, so many never even question it at all in the first place. There's also plenty of incentive to abide by it, because if you stay within the acceptable limit of liberal Zionist speech on Israel-Palestine, you're more likely to be given that nice government job, or to get somewhere in academia, or to be regularly invited to feature in the mainstream media, and be allowed to write op-eds in their publications. The end result of all of this is that actual anti-Zionist speech is kept to the fringes, and many people who might otherwise become anti-Zionists are funneled into upholding liberal Zionism instead. I think it's really one of the most successful examples of Western propaganda narratives being subtly normalized and spread that I've ever seen. It's practically treated like the sun coming up in the morning. It's just that normal. So now that you know what we're talking about here, how it's enforced, by whom, and why, I'm going to get to presenting some actual real-world specific examples of how this works and dissect them. Examples from all across the political spectrum, including many from left-wing people who are widely considered to be pro-Palestinian. So let's start out here with an example of the most blatant, obvious, and thoughtless expressions of this, straight from a Western government. In January 2024, when South Africa denounced Israel before the International Court of Justice for genocide in Gaza, the French Foreign Minister said, accusing the Jewish state of genocide crosses a moral threshold. Now, this is Jewish exceptionalism in its purest form. You'll note particularly there that he chooses to use the term Jewish state instead of Israel. That is a very conscious choice to emphasize the Jewishness of this state. It's a very crude form of emotional manipulation. The argument at play here is really stupid when you actually think about it. It's that Jews are a special group of people, Israel is a Jewish state, therefore, Israel cannot commit genocide, and actually it's even immoral to say that it could. This sort of argument would be laughed at in any other similar circumstance. But because it's Israel, we're supposed to take it very seriously. There's also, as always, the unspoken but ever-present implication that not taking this argument seriously would be anti-Semitic, an allegation that is almost universally used by Zionists so that they can avoid having to actually deal with the facts and arguments at hand, and instead shift the focus of the discussion onto allegations of prejudice against the person, people, or organization who are putting said facts and arguments forward. Such allegations only have the particular power that they do because of Jewish exceptionalism. Obviously, whether something is genocide or not is not decided by looking at the ethnic identity of the people accused of carrying it out, but rather by analyzing the facts and the evidence and deciding whether or not they fit the definition. The French Foreign Minister's argument is designed to avoid any of that, by instead just appealing to the ingrained idea of Jewish exceptionalism. And that sort of thing actually works a lot, which is crazy when you think about the actual substance of the argument, because there's none. Other very prominent examples of this sort of very lazy but nonetheless very effective Jewish exceptionalism can be seen in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which since being created in 2016 has become something of a canon among Israel-supporting governments and organizations. This idea is given more power by the fact that the organization that made this definition comes off as a sort of neutral organization dedicated just to the remembrance of the Holocaust. There's nothing wrong with that, you know? So why would anyone assume any ill will in their definition of anti-Semitism? But this organization was straight up created by Western countries and Israel, so it's safe to assume that it's going to be pretty biased towards their geopolitical interests. And this sort of weaponization of the Holocaust is itself quite core to modern pro-Israel propaganda in the West, and to the very notion of Jewish exceptionalism. It's a big part of why it can even function, because everyone in the West knows about the Holocaust. In fact, polls actually indicate that most people in the West have never even met a Jew, and all that they really know about Jews is that the Holocaust happened to them. So when that's the extent of the knowledge of the average person, the notion that the Holocaust justifies Israel can seem a lot less stupid than it actually is. We'll be going further in depth on that point later in the video as well. Anyway, so this definition was very clearly designed to neuter the potential of anti-Israel speech by claiming that certain common arguments made against Israel are anti-Semitic. For example, let's go over two of its most ridiculous provisions. It's anti-Semitic to deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And it's anti-Semitic to compare contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. These positions are not at all different to the French foreign minister's appeal to the notion that Israel is a Jewish state so it can't do genocide, rather than actually dealing with the facts at hand. On the first provision, it's not self-determination to move somewhere, expel and murder its prior population on an ethnic basis, and take the land for yourself. That is very much anti their self-determination, if anything. So the loaded pro-Israel framing is evident just from that. And whether Israel is a racist endeavor is something that would be decided by making arguments based on an analysis of the facts. The very fact that it is a state that is clearly designed and run for one group of people at the expense of another who have been systematically dispossessed and oppressed by it since its founding would certainly point to it being a racist endeavor. But talking about that is inconvenient for Zionism, so the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism seeks to get around this problem of the facts not being on Israel's side by declaring it anti-Semitic to even think about analyzing them. And on the second provision, whether Israeli policy is similar to Nazi policy is also something that you can analyze and argue for based on the facts. For example, the Nazis wanted to conquer as much of Eastern Europe as possible for the benefit of what they conceived of as their own ethnic group at the expense of the others who were there. Something that you can also very much say about Zionism and Palestine. In fact, the Nazis very much saw their planned expansion as an act of German self-determination, just as the IHRA claims that Israel is an act of Jewish self-determination. They just openly use that exact talking point to justify their initial annexations and invasions. But the IHRA, and let's be real here, the Western countries that formed it and who it works on behalf of, would like to shut us out of being able to even think about analyzing the facts and making such comparisons. Not because such arguments are even remotely anti-Semitic, they're clearly not. It's not anti-anything to compare two colonial ethno-nationalist ideologies. Rather, it's just very bad for Zionism if it is compared to Nazism, as Nazism is very widely understood in the West as basically being the ultimate evil. So what they want to do here is deny anti-Zionists the ability to make use of this powerful and immediately understood comparison by just lazily declaring it anti-Semitic to do so, and thus scaring people into silence for fear of the potential consequences that such an accusation can have. And consequences there can be. Recently, a politician in Argentina was sentenced to a suspended prison sentence for comparing Zionism to Nazism by a court that used the IHRA definition. So the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is designed to nip actual objective discussion surrounding the reality of Zionism and Israel in the bud. Why? Well, because Israel is Jewish, that's why. So, it's anti-Semitic to ask such questions about it. How dare you even think about doing so? This sort of thing would be laughed out of the room in any other similar circumstance, and it's only due to the framework of Jewish exceptionalism that it's not in this case. In fact, the exact opposite is the case. It's actually been taken deadly seriously by many Western governments and institutions, to the point they've adopted the IHRA definition word for word, including in some cases by codifying it into law, like in Argentina. So that's two examples of really blatant Jewish exceptionalism from the more overt pro-Israel side. But they're not the only ones who abide by the framework at all. Jewish exceptionalism is, after all, very normalized in Western society, so it's also pervasive among many people who conceive of themselves as being pro-Palestinian. They often, for example, abide by its tenets, treating Jewish people as if they are a special exception, acting like the pro-Palestinian movement should cater to them specifically. An extremely curious notion, given that Palestinians are oppressed by a Jewish supremacist state. So it wouldn't seem to make much logical sense for a movement against said state to cater to Jews rather than Palestinians. The quintessential example of this is the British political commentator Owen Jones. Jones has appeared regularly in the mainstream media as one of their chosen voices to represent the Palestinian side for more than a decade. This prominence is a result of the fact that he has always been very diligent in staying within and propagating the confines that they allow. That is, liberal Zionism as the acceptable limit of pro-Palestinian speech, and Jewish exceptionalism as the framework which upholds this. They allow him to denounce what Israel does, for example, by acknowledging the genocide in Gaza or being against the occupation of the West Bank, but not what Israel is. So he avoids as much as possible critiquing its underlying Zionist ideology and getting to the bottom of why Israel does those things in the first place. In fact, as we'll be going over soon, he actually normalizes Zionist ideology, and because of that, he's managed to remain in the spotlight for a very long time, to the point that he is still employed directly in the mainstream media as a columnist for The Guardian. This is quite a contrast to his media colleagues who do actually denounce Israel for what it is, and who do actually denounce the Zionist ideology itself, who are not only entirely excluded from mainstream discourse, but who also tend to get arrested and receive visits from the police. It's also a contrast even to some of his own colleagues at The Guardian, like the cartoonist Steve Bell, who was sacked by the paper for a supposedly anti-Semitic anti-Netanyahu comic, while Jones said nothing. Jones has made arguments that are very similar to the one that we just went over regarding comparisons between Israel and Nazi Germany. In 2017, he wrote in an article that there are those who compare the occupation of Palestine to Nazi tyranny. This is an attempt to say to Jews, look, you are now doing to Palestinians what Hitler did to you. It is deeply offensive and wrong. The occupation of Palestine is bad enough on its own terms. It is oppressive and stifling and brutal. It does not represent, or even close, an attempt to physically exterminate an entire people. That one didn't age so well, did it? And in a 2020 book, he reiterated that same argument. Some make direct comparisons between the Israeli state and the Nazis, comparing the predicament of the Palestinians to that of the Jews during the Holocaust. The realities of the Israeli occupation are grim enough on their own terms. Military subjugation, the theft of land, all justified by state-sanctioned racism, without a comparison which is as offensive as it is manifestly untrue. There has been no attempt to physically exterminate the Palestinian people. The comparison is meant only to bait Jews with the memory of their most murderous persecutors. Jones, unlike the IHRA, does at least try to make a semblance of an argument there. He asserts that the Nazis committed more extensive atrocities than Israel, therefore Israel cannot be compared to them. But even if this were true, why exactly should it be off limits to point out real fact-based similarities between the two? The Nazis committed much more extensive atrocities than many other genocidal regimes, yet we constantly compare lots of stuff to them, and no one complains. This is the sort of thing that you argue on based on the facts, not by simply implying that there is some sort of default moral threshold being crossed by even thinking about doing so. There was also more to Nazism than just what they did, as both Nazi Germany and Israel have underlying colonial ethno-nationalist ideologies, and there are certainly comparisons to be made between Nazi ideology and Zionist ideology. Israel is also in a very different position to the Nazis. It's a relatively small country, limited in what it can do by its comparatively massive dependence on foreign powers and the very different geopolitical reality that it inhabits. By comparison, the Nazis, for much of their history, were in a position of great power over their victims. For many years, they operated under the assumption that there would never be any consequences for them, that no one else was powerful enough to put any limits on them. Hundreds of millions of people had to be mobilized to eventually defeat them. The Nazis killed such a large number of people, not just because they wanted to, but also because they could. If Israel thought that they had the power to do so, if they weren't limited by their allies and regional rivals, if they thought they could get away with it, what reason do we have to believe they wouldn't just kill or expel all of the Palestinians who they deem surplus to requirements? Even with the limitations that are on them, they just killed what is likely upwards of 100,000 people in Gaza and leveled literally the entire region. They've been slowly encroaching upon the West Bank for many decades. They clearly want Palestinian land, and they want the people on it gone. But geopolitical reality, combined with resistance from the Palestinians themselves, makes it difficult for them to carry out such ambitions. Ultimately, the crux of it is that these are both colonialist, ethno-nationalist ideologies, and comparing them is totally fine, even if Zionism is operating in very different circumstances. So comparing Zionism to Nazism is clearly not just possible, but legitimate. You might disagree in that you might think such comparisons are factually inaccurate, but that is entirely different to outright asserting, as Jones does, that they are offensive and morally wrong, and that the only possible reason to ever make them is to bait Jews. So when it boils down to it, the crux of his argument there is just Jewish exceptionalism. Israel should be an exception from the powerful and easily understood Nazi comparisons that are thrown out all the time in other situations because it's Jewish. That's it. Jones puts the feelings of Zionist Jewish people, who might feel offended when their ideology is compared to Nazism, above the actual facts, and above advocacy for Palestinians, for whom there is clearly great utility in comparing their oppressors to the hated evil that the Nazis represent to most people in the Western countries who provide Israel with the crucial backing that it needs to oppress Palestinians. In no other case would anyone seriously express any particular concern for the hurt feelings of people who happen to be part of an ethnic group that an ethno-supremacist state aims to advantage at the expense of others. It is, again, only due to Jewish exceptionalism that such a notion is not immediately discounted as ridiculous. It's actually instead presented as the exact opposite, really, as if it's just sort of self-evidently true, and it's rare that those who make such arguments ever even feel a need to put a smidgen of effort into backing them up. Jones's career has been built on this sort of liberal Zionist, Jewish exceptionalist rhetoric. It's the backbone of his presentation in the mainstream media as a pro-Palestinian voice. That he has been willing to police pro-Palestinian speech from the left like this and frame liberal and left Zionism as its acceptable limit has resulted in them making him into a veritable star, getting him more than a decade of mainstream media prominence, which no one pushing an actual anti-Zionist framework would ever have been given. Speaking of anti-Zionism and its crucial importance to actually being pro-Palestinian, Jones once posted a video where he argued against even using the term Zionism. Let's watch.
Now, obviously, we have to distinguish between Zionism, which is a political ideology and a political movement, and people who are Jewish, people who adhere to the Jewish religion, but also have a sense of Jewish cultural identity as well. And to be anti-Zionist or non-Zionist is not anti-Semitic. But I suppose what people like myself and on the left, I think, have learned is that the term Zionist and Zionism is too much of a catch-all term, in the sense that most Jewish people on earth do support the existence of a state of Israel. So, for example, there's a big difference between those who believe in the forcible annexation of all Palestinian land and the creation of a greater Israel, and those who believe in an independent Palestinian state based on pre-1967 borders, who were part of the besieged but courageous Israeli peace movement. So there's a difference between Likud, on the one hand, the party of Benjamin Netanyahu, a racist party as part of a very racist government, and Meretz, who are on the left and believe in a genuine peace. Now, they would both be called Zionists, but it's meaningless just to conflate them as the same thing, because obviously there's a complete huge difference, and I wouldn't say Meretz is an enemy of peace. And I think a lot of people on the left over the last few years, particularly given what's happened particularly the last 4 years, have come to understand the sensitivity of how you speak about these things. Because otherwise there's this sense of, those who believe, in genuine peace, who hate Benjamin Netanyahu, but call themselves Zionists, they're going, oh, hold on a minute, you're saying, what, I'm an enemy of peace? And obviously we have to build those bridges. I would distinguish between someone like people in Europe and the United States and Palestinians. Palestinians, in terms of talking about Zionism and Zionists, well, they're talking about their lived experience of living under occupation. So I don't think that applies in the same way. But I personally have very much come to understand that it's not helpful to just bandy around Zionist and Zionism, that they lack precision as terms, which therefore can cause hurt and distress, and they can also be misused. So what I would always now talk about is supporters of the Israeli occupation, supporters of of a brutal and illegal occupation, incidentally, of the Israeli government and so on. And they are enemies of peace, those people, those apologists for the occupation and so on.
So let's boil his argument down to its parts. 1. Zionism is too much of a catch-all, and we shouldn't use the term, because 2. Lots of Jewish people are Zionists. 3. There are different types of Zionists who have different ideas about how far Zionism should go in answering the Palestinian question. 4. Using the term negatively hurts the feelings of liberal Zionists who don't believe that they are enemies of peace. 5. Therefore, we should instead talk about supporters of occupation versus opponents of occupation. 6. Palestinians themselves can be excluded from this. They are uniquely allowed to use the term due to their lived experiences. So on the second point, it doesn't matter how many Jewish people identify as Zionists or not. The legitimacy of an ethno-nationalist ideology is not determined by whether or not it's supported by a lot of people from the group who it aims to benefit. This is a very common Jewish exceptionalist argument, which we also touched on earlier, and it's just obviously ridiculous when dissected. Zionism would be abhorrent whether it was supported by 1% of Jews or 100% of Jews, and we don't need any Jewish approval to oppose it. Actually, in other circumstances, if polls indicated that such a large portion of members of a certain community supported a violent, supremacist ideology, that would be taken as indicative of a serious and worrying problem. Imagine the Führer, for example, if a poll showed that, say, 60% of American Muslims supported the Islamic State. And yet, with Israel and Zionism, it's the exact opposite. Jewish opinion is presented like a positive thing that actually somehow legitimizes the violent racist Zionist ideology. It's just completely upside down. On the third and fourth points, that there are different types of Zionism does not make the term too imprecise to be useful. As I stated when I outlined liberal Zionism earlier, Zionism is the root of the problem in Palestine. Whether it's a harder or softer variant, as it is quite simply an ideology that is fundamentally based on the dispossession of Palestinians and the maintenance of a Jewish supremacist state in the land that was taken from them. Liberal and left Zionists are still Zionists, and thus they are against remedying this ultimate problem, hence their identification as Zionists in the first place. This is an innately genocidal ideology, because in order for Israel to exist as a Jewish ethno-state, the previous society that existed where it now stands needs to be negated and eventually destroyed entirely from the area that they claim. Thus, liberal and left Zionists are not believers in a genuine peace, as Jones claims. They rather seek a peace on their own terms, one that concedes just enough to quench their guilt while still denying Palestinians their fundamental rights and any semblance of adequate material restitution or justice. In particular, their innately ethno-nationalist Zionist ideology means that, regardless of their disagreements, they all want to deny the Palestinians their right to even live in most of their homeland, which is the land that Israel presently occupies, as that would make it impossible to maintain the Jewish ethnic majority and the ethnic privileges that are core to Zionism. This makes it abundantly clear that all Zionists, even the supposedly nice ones, are racist and Jewish supremacists. That's a reality that many of us have trouble coming to terms with. Honestly, a lot of people seem terrified to admit it, but it's absolutely true. And if you're going to effectively advocate for Palestinians, you need to be anti-Israel, you need to be anti-Zionist, and you need to come to terms with this and have the courage to say it openly. Jones mentions the Meretz political party in that clip as his example of Israeli Zionists who want genuine peace.
And I wouldn't say Meretz is an enemy of peace.
This party has since merged with other left-wing and liberal Zionist parties to form a new one called the Democrats. The leader of this new, much larger Democrats party, who was formerly one of the star members of Meretz, is Yair Golan, an IDF veteran who admitted to and defended using Palestinians as human shields. Golan describes himself as a leftist Zionist. His opinions are representative of those of the so-called peace bloc in Israel and the left/liberal Zionists in general that Jones frames as Palestinian allies. Golan believes in a two-state solution based on ethnic segregation, with Israel keeping most of its settlements in the West Bank. His reason for this is purely political. He said on the matter that, "We need to separate. We need to say, yes, we would have liked all of Eretz Israel, as it's the land of our ancestors, but we have no choice. In order to preserve the integrity of the nation, we must give up on the unity of the land. I don't see any other chance for the state of Israel." As you can see, this is not based on a desire for a genuine peace, and certainly not for care for Palestinians. He believes, rather, that Jews should have all the land for their exclusive ethnic use, but it's just unrealistic for them to want to take it. He's made it clear that his main reason for opposing Israeli annexation of the West Bank, for example, is not because it would obviously be abhorrent, immoral, and a crime for Israel to do so, but rather that this would mean that the Palestinians who live there would then be living in land that is officially considered a part of Israel, and then Jews would suddenly be a minority. That is his reasoning. It is purely ethno-nationalist. These people were openly saying this sort of stuff long before Jones made these arguments about how they are our allies and how we shouldn't use Zionists negatively so not to alienate them. And they did so in English as well. This article on the screen right now, it's in English, in Haaretz. On top of that, he's openly stated that Israel occupies Palestine, but that this occupation is justified for Israel's security, and he thinks boycotting or sanctioning Israel is anti-Semitic. This is not just some random guy. It's the current leader of the so-called Zionist left, who openly identifies himself as a Zionist leftist. In truth, the Zionist left or liberal Zionist labels have a lot more to do with differences in opinion regarding how the Jewish ethno-state should be run for Jews, rather than that treatment of Palestinians. They are against pushing for more Palestinian land and in favor of agreeing to an absurdly unjust peace settlement on Israeli terms, but this is because they believe that this is what would be the best course to secure the future of Israel as a Jewish-majority ethno-state. It has nothing to do with concern for Palestinians at all. In short, he is clearly a proponent of Jewish supremacy, continued Zionist colonialism, and ethnic segregation. His reason for being open to compromise is pragmatism, nothing more, nothing less. It may be confronting, but the reality is that, in terms of actual partners for a real peace in Israel, as in actual anti-Zionists, there's like hundreds of people total, perhaps a couple thousand at most if I'm being generous, aside from the Palestinian citizens of Israel, of course. And among them, those who actually try to take action number what, in like the dozens, the low hundreds? It's nice to imagine that we have an abundance of real allies among the Israeli population, but we simply don't. The vast majority of Israelis want to maintain Zionism and the ethnic privileges it affords them at the cost of Palestinians. And that is true whether they frame themselves as liberal humanists, leftists, or outright far-right fascists. If things are going to change, it sadly is not going to be with tons of Israeli allies at our side. It'll have to be through some form of coercion, whether that be international pressure through sanctions and boycotts, through forcing Western governments to withdraw their support for Israel, through military action or other forms of pressure, not through sitting around a campfire with liberal Zionists and singing Kumbaya. On the fifth point, a Zionist who opposes occupation of the West Bank and Israeli encroachment into Gaza is still ultimately a Zionist, as I just demonstrated. Saying that we should use softer language to describe left or liberal Zionists to avoid alienating them when they are, in fact, fundamentally still enemies of Palestinian liberation and fundamentally believers in an abhorrent, unacceptable ethno-nationalist ideology only serves to lead people away from identifying Zionism as the root of the problem. So yes, using the term Zionist is not only fine, but absolutely required required, even if it encompasses those people and also the Israeli right wing, as all of them fundamentally believe in and uphold the root of the problem, which is the continuation of Palestinian dispossession in order to maintain a Jewish ethno-state on land that they expelled and murdered Palestinians in order to clear. We need to be able to use the right terminology to describe this, and Zionism is it. On the sixth and last point, the reason why it's fine for Palestinians to use the term has nothing to do with lived experience. In fact, it has nothing to do with who they are at all, aside from the fact that them being Palestinian and experiencing Zionist oppression firsthand logically makes them far more interested than average in analyzing and understanding their own situation, which thus makes them more likely to have an accurate assessment of it. So the reason why it's fine for Palestinians, and also fine for everyone else to use the term Zionist, is that it's an accurate term that describes the enemies of the Palestinians and their ideology in precisely the way that they need to be described and understood if the Palestinian problem is ever to be solved with any justice for them at all. If I had to make a more identity politics-based argument though, I'd say that to deny us the ability to use the same terminology that Palestinians themselves use is to deny Palestinians leadership of their own movement. Should we not be in step with them, rather than advocating on their behalf in completely different ways to them, making constant concessions to the feelings of their oppressors? Jones later reiterated this same argument years later, writing, "The imprecise use of Zionism and Zionists in the West is deeply problematic, leaving it eviscerated of meaning. After all, those self-describing as Zionists include everyone from Israeli hard-right extremists who desire the annexation of all Palestinian lands to create a greater Israel encompassing Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank, to Israeli peaceniks who support the end of the Palestinian occupation." A 2015 survey found that while 59% of British Jews self-identified as Zionists, 90% supported Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, the traditional Zionist aspiration. For many Jews, angry denunciations of Zionists mean one thing, whatever the intention of the speaker, purely and simply a contemporary manifestation of age-old angry tirades against the Jews. This is the same argument, but this time he saw fit to tack on an implication at the end that using the term Zionist is anti-Semitic because many Jews, according to him, consider it as such. The reality is that, quite frankly, if a Jewish person is offended by accurate usage of the word Zionist, you should just roll your eyes and ignore them. The feelings of people who have any sympathies for an ethno-nationalist ideology that exists for the benefit of their own ethnicity should hold absolutely zero sway over how we oppose it. Sharing an ethnicity with the dominant ethnic group in an ethno-supremacist state does not make you a special boy who is worthy of special treatment when discussing said ethno-supremacist state. Jews are not an exception to these pretty basic logical principles. Jones's argument there is emblematic of the linkage that I made in this video between Jewish exceptionalism and the enforcement of liberal Zionism as the limit of acceptable, supposedly pro-Palestinian speech in the mainstream. It's actually probably the best example of how this is enforced that I've ever seen. It's an argument for why we should deny ourselves our very ability to even describe the problem on the basis of absolutely nothing but the idea that this might cause hurt feelings among people who are very much a part of the problem themselves. In no other situation would such a ridiculous notion be put forth so confidently. But here, because these feelings are those of people who happen to be Jewish, there's this default implication, thanks to Jewish exceptionalism, that they need to be taken very seriously, unless you want to be accused of anti-Semitism, that is. So on the basis of nothing more than the hurt feelings of people who believe in the ideology that oppresses Palestinians, we need to completely neuter our position to the point that we aren't even really pro-Palestinian anymore, and are instead just advocating for the anti-Palestinian ideologies of liberal Zionism and left Zionism. Now, I understand that this may be confronting for some of you because you might like Jones, you might even admire him, and I understand the inherent risk in even including someone like him in this, regardless of how justified I clearly am in doing so, given the stuff that he said. Because a lot of people are just going to miss the point here and tune out once they hear someone speaking negatively of a figure who they like. Many people, sadly, don't really seem to care that much about what is being said, and only really pay attention to who's saying it. But the point of this video is not that Owen Jones is good or bad. It's not about him at all. His statements cited here are merely great examples of Jewish exceptionalism and how it enforces and upholds liberal Zionism as pro-Palestinian. I'm not even sure if Jones really understands the ultimate implications of what he was saying in these arguments of his. He may very well be completely genuine, totally sincere in his belief that he's actually making pro-Palestinian arguments, and that liberal and left Zionists are actually awesome pro-Palestinian allies who we all need to base our entire being around catering to. But he's still wrong, and the effect is the same regardless. By advocating for these positions from his prominent position as a supposedly pro-Palestinian voice in the mainstream media, he acts as an enforcer of Jewish exceptionalism and its acceptable limit of liberal Zionism, and therefore ultimately upholds Jewish supremacy in Israel. Such arguments contribute to the continuation of the problem, not to fighting it. And since it's him doing this that has made him the British media's go-to guy when they need someone to present as being representative of the pro-Palestinian side, and allowed him to maintain the kind of jobs that actual anti-Zionists could never get close to, he's clearly been incentivized to keep this up. And again, whether he's conscious of this or not, doing this intentionally or not, is ultimately not important to the overall point, because the result is the same. I just want you to keep in mind though that Jones does this thing that a lot of mainstream media types do, in that once they feel that it has become a lot safer for them to do so, they take on certain more radical positions that they had previously said nothing on or been outright opposed to, and act like they held those positions all along when they have not. So after others have spent decades taking the risk, enduring the consequences of normalizing such positions to get them to the point where someone like Jones can say them without taking any risk in doing so, he'll finally be happy to take advantage of this, and honestly even to take credit for it himself, when the reality is that the stuff that he had been spreading beforehand actively made it more difficult for this stuff to become mainstream, and he's simply taking advantage of it once it finally is. Those who do this sort of thing are detrimental, as they do not actually move the needle at all. They only move once the needle has already moved, once others have put in the work and taken the real risk in moving it. It wouldn't surprise me if now that Owen Jones has a massive social media following, and is clearly able to generate a lot of money on his own, he makes a big fuss about going independent sometime in the near future, and starts talking about Zionism and stuff. Finally, after all these years of avoiding the topic and talking about the settlements and the occupation and the two-state solution. It's not really activism, it's not really moving the needle, it's not really doing what needs to be done, it is opportunism, and you should look out for it. Jones has also argued that Israel should not be considered a settler colonial state because it's Jewish. I quote, "While the brutality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands is undeniable, the situation was, and is, fundamentally different from those projects of European settler colonialism. In those horrors, Europeans arrived to plant their flags to claim land on behalf of their own states, while Israel's founders were fleeing the flags of their old nations. Rhodesia, for example, was not founded by survivors of a genocide who had already suffered 2 millennia of persecution. Israel was both a state founded by victims of unimaginable horrors seeking a refuge, and a state in which many saw the characteristics of old-style settler colonialism. Anybody who doesn't desire security for the Jewish people of Israel is as dangerous as they are wrong-headed. Many Jews who are politically hostile, both to the occupation of Palestinian territories and to Israel's depressing right-wing trajectory, nonetheless retain a profoundly emotional connection with Israel, a state which is seen as a refuge, however imperfect, if, once again, the winds shift and the anti-Semites come back for more." So the argument there goes that Israel cannot so simply be described as settler colonialism. His first reason for this is that Israel's founders were apparently refugees. That is just flatly not true for 2 reasons. Israel was planned out as a colonial project since the tail end of the 19th century by people who very much were not refugees. In fact, if anything, they were sort of high society people, very well off in their home countries. And the actual founders of the Israeli state themselves, who acted on such plans many decades later, were not refugees either. David Ben-Gurion, for example, the first Prime Minister of Israel and the leader of its foundational expulsions and mass killings of Palestinians, had moved to Palestine in 1906 due to his belief in Zionism as a nationalist ideology, not as a refugee. He famously wrote, "For many of us, anti-Semitic feeling had little to nothing to do with our dedication to Zionism. I personally never suffered anti-Semitic persecution. My hometown was remarkably free of it. Nevertheless, it was my hometown that sent the highest proportion of Jews to Israel from any town in Poland of comparable size. We emigrated not for negative reasons of escape, but for the positive purpose of rebuilding a homeland." Regardless, whether Israel was founded by refugees or not, this does not preclude it from being settler colonial. Few would seriously argue that the USA can't be settler colonial because many Irish and other types of refugees went there, or that Liberia couldn't be because the colonists there were former black American slaves. Settler colonialism has nothing to do with the characteristics of the people who are carrying it out, and everything to do with what they do. The Zionists colonized Palestine, upended the previously existing society and people, and replaced them with their own people and society, in a process that's still ongoing today. That is settler colonialism in a nutshell. The second half of the paragraph is really just an appeal to Jewishness as a magical essence that we need to uniquely defer to. We already dealt with the bit about liberal Zionists being framed as allies, so I'll skip over that this time. But he also says, anyone who doesn't desire security for the Jewish people of Israel is as dangerous as they are wrong-headed. So what does that even mean? The people of Israel are the oppressors of Palestinians. If there's risk to their so-called security, then they cause such risks by doing colonialism, which is an innately dangerous enterprise that breeds resistance among its victims. The idea that we need to stop and think deeply about the security of those who live at the cost of Palestinians and who cause this supposed risk to their own security as a result is just kind of ridiculous, and it can only come from a Jewish exceptionalist mindset. And why even mention the fact that they're Jewish? This is done very often by Jewish exceptionalists, as a form of crude emotional manipulation. The Jewishness of Israelis is emphasized in circumstances where their specific ethnicity is just irrelevant. They do this because it immediately puts their opponents on guard, as the sly, unnecessary replacement of certain terms with Jewish puts them at risk of being accused of anti-Semitism. It should not make a difference to you whether Palestine is colonized by Peruvians, Ugandans, Mormons, or Jews. It should matter to you that it's colonized. And the last line is just so ridiculous. The notion that we should care at all about the emotional connection that some guy in the West feels for an ethno-nationalist settler colonial project, and that his worry about hypothetical future persecution somehow legitimizes this project. Like, really? It's exactly as I've said all throughout this video. It's just an absurdly stupid thing to say. Something that no one would ever take seriously in any other circumstance. But you add the word Jewish in there, and suddenly, everything changes. That's precisely the thing that we need to challenge if we're ever going to actually get anywhere on real Palestinian liberation. Jones's argument for why Israel can't so simply be considered a settler colonial project is very similar to arguments that right-wing Zionists make to legitimize the state of Israel. For example, here's one from an overtly pro-Israel YouTuber, Lonabox. And please note that I am not responsible for adding the Israeli national anthem to this clip. Rather, a bunch of Zionists saw it and they thought it was so inspiring and such a good, uncontestable argument that they decided to add the music to it and post it everywhere as pro-Israel propaganda.
The majority of people who live in Israel are refugees from the Arab and Muslim world. The rest of them are largely people who came from the Holocaust, or from 1300 pogroms in Russia, or from anti-Semitism rising in the 20s and 30s. That's why they're there. And you are treating them like they are just some imperial-backed colony like French Algeria or South Africa or something else. And you think that these people are ever going to be dislodged. There's two things that are never going to happen in that country, okay? One is they're not going to accept being a minority. Never. Not the way that Jews have been treated in the Middle East as minorities by every other Arab Muslim country. They're also never going to leave because they have nowhere else to go. As long as you ignore the real reality and the lived experience of Jews that created Zionism, as long as you keep treating a genuine movement of people who were refugees, who had nowhere else to go in the world, going to a place and deciding, this is our home. If this is not our home, we die. And you don't acknowledge that because you just think it's, white Europeans coming with the British and the American. Then yes, you're anti-Semitic because your entire analysis of Israel is completely ignorant of the real experience of Jews that resulted in them going to Palestine.
While this argument is presented more aggressively than Jones's, with the allegation of anti-Semitism being made openly rather than simply being implied, it's nonetheless fundamentally identical. Jews can't do settler colonialism because of historical Jewish oppression, and Israel is uniquely legitimized by said history. An argument that, as I just went over, is bunk on the face of it, because that's simply not how settler colonialism is defined anyway. If we boil these arguments down to their actual substance, of which there isn't much, they're essentially just saying, if you're from an ethnic group that has been oppressed, you cannot do colonialism. This might not seem Jewish exceptionalist on the face of it, because sure, it's a bad and wrong argument, but it's not just they're Jewish, therefore it's okay. But what makes this Jewish exceptionalist is that it's clear that the people who make these arguments only actually believe this in the case of Israel. Palestinians, for example, are nearly universally an oppressed people, living under the crushing boot of Zionist oppression and massacre. The vast majority of Palestinians in the world today are even internationally recognized refugees. Does that mean that if Palestinians created a settler colonial ethno-nationalist movement to go colonize Uganda or something, that it would be more acceptable than any other? That it would be more legitimate? Obviously, these people don't believe that. In fact, both Owen Jones and Lonerbox have made clear that they even believe that the very much not colonial idea of Palestinians simply returning to the land and home stolen from them in Israel proper, within living memory, is genocidal against Jews. So the actual core of their argument, the deciding factor for them, is just an exception made specifically for Jewish people, and nothing more. As I hinted at earlier, one key way in which Jewish exceptionalism is enforced is through the notion that the Holocaust was a sort of singular, unequal genocide, totally divorced from anything before or after it, that cannot be compared with anything else, and that this special status that it supposedly holds is a part of what makes Jews such a special exception. This idea was originally popular in the West, and particularly Germany, from the 60s, 70s, and 80s onwards, where it became something of a cult in academia for a time, before largely being superseded by much better scholarship that rightfully puts the Holocaust in the context of broader European histories of violence, genocide, and colonialism. But those developments aren't very convenient if you're just sort of looking to justify Israel as something unique and special. So a lot of people still hang on to the Holocaust being unique and incomparable to anything else, like a complete historical anomaly, entirely unlinked from everything before and after, because that's just way more convenient when you're looking to justify Israel and Zionism. Owen Jones has made this argument before, in a bizarre article where he asserted that the first tenet of the pro-Palestine movement should be the ritualistic acknowledgement of the Holocaust as the biggest single crime in history. I don't want to dwell too much on the article itself, so here's just a quick aside about it. In it, Jones argues that a left approach to Israel-Palestine must be centered not around the actual reality, that is the Zionist settler colonial oppression of Palestinians, but instead on the feelings of Jewish people. Aside from ritualistic condemnation of the Holocaust, he also prescribes that we deny the well-documented Zionist collaboration with the Nazis, dishonestly framing this as Jewish rather than Zionist. Remember what I said earlier about the emotional manipulation? Not on the basis of the actual historical facts, because there was quite a bit of Zionist collaboration with the Nazis in reality, but rather on the basis that it's supposedly offensive. He additionally asserts that we should listen to Jewish lived experiences regarding anti-Semitism, a ridiculous notion given that many Jews are Zionists, and Zionists are happy to weaponize and falsify claims of anti-Semitism, so we definitely should not defer to them when it comes to defining it. Whether something is anti-Semitic or not should be determined by analyzing it, not because a Jewish person said so. Same with any other form of racism or anything else. Otherwise, you're just opening yourself up to be declared an anti-Semite or a racist or whatever other pejorative the second that someone with the correct identity category calls you as such, which, is just kind of a weird way to operate. He then asserts that we should make very special efforts to make sure Jews feel welcome in the pro-Palestinian movement and express solidarity with the left Zionists in Israel who we talked about earlier. So in his prescriptions for the pro-Palestine movement, 5 out of 8 of them are just about how special Jews are and how the pro-Palestine movement should be centered around them. Now this is simply not how anyone would ever think of organizing a movement in any other circumstance. Of course, if Jews want to be a part of the pro-Palestine movement, they're welcome, but not as extra special people who get put on a pedestal for their ethnicity, rather on the exact same terms that apply to anyone else. And if those terms make any of them uncomfortable, then that's not indicative of a problem with the movement. It's indicative of their own sympathies with Zionism. And we do not, and should not, change to cater to them. They aren't special. It's totally backwards and frankly just kind of bizarre to create a special set of criteria that the movement abide by, effectively neutering it entirely, specifically to appeal to people who happen to share an ethnicity with the dominant ethnic group of an ethno-supremacist project, and who often have sympathies with it. And again, I know I must sound like a broken record by now, but the only reason something so clearly ludicrous can even be proposed and taken seriously is due to Jewish exceptionalism. Anyway, so back to the point of the Holocaust needing to be acknowledged as a special genocide. Jones's only real justification for it being so special is that it was industrialized, systemic, and bureaucratic. But pretty much every genocide ever has been systemic. I'm not exactly sure how one could ever not be, and many have been bureaucratic, carried out coldly from the top down, from politician to gun barrel, via laws and legislation. So that leaves us with the industrialized part. I wonder if the people who make this sort of argument even know that until 1942, the Holocaust was mostly carried out with just guns. Around 2 million to 2.5 million of its victims were simply hunted down and shot, in the same manner that colonial genocides had been carried out for centuries beforehand. The Nazis, in fact, took direct inspiration from previous colonial genocides in carrying out the Holocaust, and considered their conquest of Eastern Europe to be very analogous to the American conquest of the West. Does being killed by guns make the deaths of those Jews less important, less meaningful? Because if it's only the industrialized part that makes the Holocaust special, then yeah, that seems to be the implication. And said implication clearly poses more problems even outside of the context of the Holocaust. What exactly makes a Jew murdered in a gas chamber a more worthy victim than a Native American murdered by US soldiers' bayonets? And what exactly makes a Jew murdered in a Nazi gas chamber more of a victim than the Romani also killed with that same gas? It's an arbitrary distinction. Additionally, the fact that the Holocaust, for years of its duration, was carried out similarly to previous colonial genocides clearly implies that it can actually be compared to them, and that it evolved into the death camp system later had just as much to do with the time and circumstances in which it took place as it did with the brutality of the Nazis. There is no real reason to believe that, in similar circumstances and with similar industrial means, that other genociders, like the Americans of the 19th century, or the Belgians who genocided the Congo, or the Turks who genocided the Armenians, would not have utilized similar methods. If you're interested in an in-depth look at how the Holocaust can very much be compared and contrasted to the other genocides that preceded it, I have a very long and in-depth video on that very topic you might want to check out when you're done here. You're certainly allowed to make a value judgment for the Holocaust being the worst genocide, though I'd question your motivations for doing so, as the Genocide Olympics is honestly kind of a weird thing to partake in, which is why those who do this generally have an ulterior motive of implying that Israel is uniquely justified by the Holocaust. The thing is though, that's always going to be an opinion, it's not something that can ever be a fact. Yet those who uphold the Holocaust in this way present their value judgments as if they were incontestable facts, and imply or outright state that you are anti-Semitic if you disagree. And even if it were true, and the Holocaust could somehow be scientifically declared as the worst event ever, something that nothing else can or should ever be compared to, that would still not legitimize Jewish ethno-nationalism and settler colonialism in Palestine even slightly. It might explain how some of the colonists came to the decision to colonize Palestine, but an explanation is not a justification. Ultimately, as Norman Finkelstein outlined in his book, The Holocaust Industry, the specific canonization of the Holocaust, and this notion that it's offensive to compare it to literally anything else in any capacity at all, is strategic. Initially, for 2 decades after World War II, focus on Holocaust remembrance was seen as a communist act, designed to hamper West Germany's post-war geopolitical integration into the US-led Western Bloc. The Holocaust only started to be so widely remembered as Westerners remember it today in the aftermath of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, when Israel proved itself to be very capable of fighting against America's regional opponents, and thereafter became central to the USA's Middle Eastern strategy. Suddenly, focusing on the Holocaust was no longer a communist thing, and this idea that historical Jewish victimhood and especially the Holocaust are things that uniquely legitimize Israel started to be spread far and wide in the West, birthing the Jewish Exceptionalist ideology which skews our perceptions of the oppression of the Palestinian people to this very day. The last example I'm covering here is probably going to make a lot of you very uncomfortable, but it's no less important. Leave your discomfort at the door and at least try to think objectively here. In November 2023, with the Gaza genocide in its most lethal month, Owen Jones happened upon a tweet that said, "This morning, my community is processing this vandalism at a synagogue in Mercer Island, a suburb of Seattle. What does this accomplish?" Attached was a video showing anti-genocide slogans written on the walls of a synagogue. Jones was quick to jump at this chance to performatively denounce anti-Semitism, and I guess sort of prove to the Zionists who call him anti-Semitic that he's actually not, amplifying an ongoing campaign by Zionists to frame this event as evidence of an anti-Semitism crisis, supposedly caused by those opposed to the Gaza genocide, which in their warped minds would legitimize said genocide. But what he actually should have done here is to ask questions about this, as you should in any case about anything. Like, what synagogue is this? Is there perhaps a political reason that these anti-genocide slogans may have been written on its walls outside, rather than just as he claimed, age-old anti-Jewish hate. As it turns out, yes, this synagogue is the Herzl Ner Tamid Zionist synagogue. They proudly explain that their core tenets are the ideals of social justice, equality, and a strong support for Israel. Now, if you didn't know, Theodor Herzl is the founder of the racist colonial ideology of political Zionism, and is considered by the Israeli state to be the spiritual father of the nation. Herzl was not at all religious. He considered Jewishness to be sort of a nationality and ethnicity. So a religious institution naming themselves after a very much secular figure like that is not doing so because of his religious holiness or anything like that. They're doing it because they agree with his racist ideology. This synagogue's head rabbi is Jacob Herber, a leader of AIPAC's Washington State chapter. Yes, the notorious American pro-Israel lobby organization. Let us imagine some analogous scenarios. There's a mosque called the Osama bin Laden Al-Qaeda Mosque, headed by an imam who is a member of the More 9/11s lobby. Someone graffitis the mosque with anti-9/11 slogans. Is that an anti-Muslim attack? I don't think so. How about a church called, say, the Hitler KKK Church, led by a card-carrying member of the Ku Klux Klan? Would it be anti-Christian discrimination to vandalize said church with anti-white supremacist slogans? Again, I don't think so. You might think these scenarios are not analogous, but you're wrong, and that's the problem. They are. That's the entire point of this video. To challenge this idea that Zionism should be an exception just because it's an ideology that claims to represent Jews. Naming a synagogue after the founder of a genocidal settler colonial ideology and advocating for that ideology is no less vile than naming a mosque after Osama bin Laden and advocating for his ideology would be. Actually, it's a whole lot worse, because Zionism has hurt way more people than bin Laden ever did. Does that mean that this vandalism was a good idea? No, God no. The people who did it should have known how it would be framed, and that nearly everyone, including supposed allies like Owen Jones, would ignore the genocidal ideology that the synagogue openly advocates for to paint this as little more than the most crude and basic manifestation of anti-Semitism. So it's just immensely stupid. There's hundreds of better targets for such a protest. You know, going after an Israel supplying arms company or something like that is probably as risky as this, yet comes with none of the baggage. Anyone who actually seeks to provide context was always going to be drowned out in a sea of performative denunciations of anti-Semitism by Zionists frothing at the mouth to weaponize anything that they can get their hands on to legitimize genocide. But that doesn't mean that the act itself was actually anti-Semitic. The institution that was targeted clearly venerates Zionism, to the extent that it's named after the ideology's founder, openly and proudly declares support for Israeli ethno-nationalist settler colonialism as its core value, and is led by members of the worst pro-Israel lobby organization in the world. Protesting against such an institution on the basis of its abhorrent politics is not at all anti-Semitic. Just like it wouldn't be anti-Christian to, say, protest the Russian Orthodox Church that supports the war in Ukraine, which has actually been done, by the way. It's only due to Jewish exceptionalism that these sorts of zero-context condemnations can fly so easily, without anyone daring to ask if there may have been a political basis to the protest. Some Jewish institutions very much do support the abhorrent Zionist ideology, and it shouldn't be taboo to acknowledge that fact, yet it very much is. And this is the core of the problem here. We need to conceive of Zionism for what it is: abhorrent, unacceptable, racist, ethnic supremacist, colonial, and we need to fight it in the same uncompromising way that we would any other similar ideology. Yet even some who paint themselves as pro-Palestinian, with many adoring fans who hang on their every word, outright argue against even understanding Israel in such terms, implying that it's anti-Semitic to accurately analyze, diagnose, and describe the problem. Jewish exceptionalism is so pervasive that such positions can be presented as being pro-Palestinian when they're clearly anything but. By abiding to this framework and its limitations, we ultimately do the work of Zionism. We funnel people right into it, whether we mean to or not. Each of us who does so is contributing to its continuation, and helping in our own little way to ensure that events like what we have seen recently in Gaza will keep repeating cyclically far into the future. There's a really interesting clip from, of all people, far-right white supremacist media personality Tucker Carlson. The context is that Carlson was criticized by the ADL for him framing immigration to the USA as the ethnic replacement of what he heavily implied was white people, which according to his complaint would eventually make them a minority. This was his response.
Go to the Anti-Defamation League's website sometime if you'd like a glimpse of what an unvarnished conversation about a country's national interest might look like. In a short essay posted to the site, the ADL explains why the State of Israel should not allow more Arabs to become citizens with voting rights. Quote, with historically high birth rates among the Palestinians and a possible influx of Palestinian refugees and their descendants now living around the world, the ADL explains, Jews would quickly become a minority within a binational state, thus likely ending any semblance of equal representation and protections. In this situation, the Jewish population would be increasingly politically and potentially physically vulnerable. It is unrealistic and unacceptable, the ADL continues, to expect the State of Israel to voluntarily subvert its own sovereign existence and nationalist identity and become a vulnerable minority within what was once its own territory, end quote. Now, from Israel's perspective, this makes perfect sense. Why would any democratic nation make its own citizens less powerful? Isn't that the deepest betrayal of all? In the words of the ADL, why would a government subvert its own sovereign existence? Good question. Maybe ADL President Jonathan Greenblatt will join us sometime to explain and tell us whether that same principle applies to the United States.
That's just hilarious, isn't it? The ADL have the gall to tell others that their ethno-nationalism is wrong while they openly advocate for it for Jews in Israel, like it's the most normal thing ever. Just openly fear-mongering about Palestinians being a demographic threat to Israel's Jewish majority. And barely anyone even notices the contradiction. Everyone just sort of nods along. All because of Jewish exceptionalism. Carlson's conclusion that if Israel can do it, we should be able to do it too, is obviously wrong, but he's not wrong at all in identifying the fact that this is a clear double standard. It's abhorrent, disgusting, and unacceptable in both cases, and it needs to be properly perceived as such. There is an excellent article by the Palestinian activist Mohammed al-Kurd, whose family home in Jerusalem was stolen by the Israeli state and given to Jewish settlers. It's titled, "Jewish Settlers Stole My House. It's not my fault they're Jewish." It is precisely about the very chilling effect that our abiding to Jewish exceptionalism has, even on Palestinians like himself, who feel like they can't even speak openly and frankly about what's being done to them just because it's being done by people who happen to be Jewish. A Palestinian's perceived resentment doesn't have the backing of a Knesset to codify it into law. Tropes aren't drones, nor can one convert conspiracy theories into nuclear weapons. We are past the early 1900s. Things are different. Power has shifted. Words are not murder. Here is where I stand. There is a Jew who lives by force in half of my home in Jerusalem, and he does so by divine decree. Many others reside, by force, in Palestinian houses, while their owners linger in refugee camps. It isn't my fault that they're Jewish. I have zero interest in memorizing or apologizing for centuries-old tropes created by Europeans, or in giving semantics more heft than they warrant. Chiefly, when millions of us confront real, tangible oppression, living behind cement walls or under siege or in exile, and living with woes too expansive to summarize. I'm tired of the impulse to preemptively distance myself from something of which I am not guilty, and I'm particularly tired of the assumption that I'm inherently bigoted. I am tired of the pearl-clutching pretense that should such animosity exist, its existence would be inexplicable and rootless. And most of all, I'm tired of the false equivalence between semantic violence and systemic violence. The idea that we must all police ourselves on Palestine because of which ethnic group happens to be oppressing the Palestinians must die. Because as long as it remains alive, we're going to be preventing ourselves from even diagnosing the problem, let alone moving towards a solution, and we will be doing a disservice to Mohammed and to every other Palestinian. In fact, even worse, we will be enabling the continuation of the problem. Zionism, in all its variants, is an unacceptable Jewish supremacist ideology, and Israel is the real-world manifestation of its core Jewish supremacist tenets in practice. It's time to stop pretending otherwise. Time to stop allowing ourselves to be misled by anyone who says otherwise. And especially time to stop acting like those who victimize Palestinians are victims themselves. They aren't. To effectively challenge Zionism and Israel, we must free ourselves from the notion that there's anything special about them, just because they're for Jews. We must treat them the same as we would neo-Nazis, white supremacists, or any other ethno-supremacist movement, because that's what they are. Only then will we have a chance of ever getting anywhere. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this and you'd like to see more like it, subscribe to my channel. And if you really liked it and you would like to support me so that I continue to make more stuff like this, then you can head on over to my Patreon or Ko-fi where you can become a monthly supporter, or on Ko-fi you can also send one-time donations. Now I'd just like to thank all of my patrons and especially my $25 plus patrons: Jordy, Alexa Nopt, Communist Functionary, S, Falafel Stand, The Son of Sandy, Ya Makamat Ya Habib, Jakagora, Lucian, Osman Malik, Qualia, Firefox42, Robokami, Ace-Malad, Brosnan, Gel Cribson, and my $10 plus supporters. Bad Sambusa, the Empanada Brigades, Okolano, Atuin, Mira, Viparamesh, Epikeya, Pacifist 23456, 9 Benadryls, J, K, Gareth Miguel, Robin, Lee Breeze, Lorenzino, Goio, Brave Neurosis, The Big L, Adrian Naku, Bubbly T, Gabagundam 4444, Bicep, You Can Change Your Name, Noah Larson, Ermis Goodspiel, T Street, Cockled Badger, Jizdog, Support Libraries, Asma B, Hector Obregon, Clement Fudge, Conrad Napwile, Soyborn, Megan Lowndes, Kieran Goodwin, Louis Bravo, Jack Paul, Max Halland, Ant, Eric Perkins, Minijan, Happy Nephron, Johnny Rocket, B, Nibiru, Ugopnik, Eric Macdans, XXXX, Can't Care Less, and Christian Corniels. Thank you. See you next time.